You're listening to the Overfunctioning Leadership Podcast, learning leadership concepts through life experience. Well, welcome back, friends, to the Overfunctioning Leadership Podcast. I'm Alex.
John.
Zach.
And we are happy to have you in this December podcast in which we are going to be discussing how to deal with your family during the holidays.
What a great subject.
Or perhaps stated differently, how your family should deal with you in the holidays.
No.
Because we have to appreciate what they're up against.
Yeah, I mean, I just look at Zach and I think, man, there's a lot going on there.
No. I am an enigma. Crack my shell open.
Anyway, so before we get there, of course, we're going to recap 2 weeks ago. Well, I guess 3 weeks ago. Anyways, our last Overfunctioning Leadership podcast was about how to be more self-differentiated. So, gentlemen, in a brief recap, how do you become more self-differentiated?
It's a great basic topic. We talk all the time about differentiation, and we almost never explain what it is, which is awesome. So in the episode before that, we explained what differentiation is, and then we didn't explain how to achieve it. And so, you know, it was just a great introductory podcast to a basic fundamental aspect of Bowen's family systems theory, which basically can be phrased as how to become a better self, how to be who you are, even when you're among other people.
Yeah, I think the internal part of differentiation is navigating thinking and feeling successfully, and the external portion is how do I navigate self in the midst of group pressure. And so the question you pose is, how does one differentiate self? First of all, it's a lifelong journey. It's not an easy process. And the podcast topic for this one, and I think our next one as well, dealing with families in the holidays, those are the petri dish. Can I use those words?
Yes. That's
The petri
with
dish
auger.
of self-differentiation. If one can learn how to do those two aspects, feel and think at appropriate times, and then also be an individual self in the midst of family, that's the hardest realm to do it in. So one area to think about doing it in is this holiday season. Be an observer in your family. See what's going on and think how you might respond differently than you have in the past.
Yep. So that's a little self-differentiation, and answering that trying to answer that question is difficult from the standpoint of when it comes to systems theory and the leadership theory that we adhere to. There's not like a 7-point checklist here. It's about self-growth, right? So also, Zach really loved the movie that we watched lately.
Oh, it was a
we had
gem.
a movie review of The Godfather. Zach, tell me how that went.
So Alex and I were looking for something that would be a little bit more mainstream than Fences. And so we thought, wow, let's watch The Godfather. It's a classic. And it is a classic. You could tell that it was made in 1973. Which
72.
72. I just wanted to be more modern. But you saw basically a 1973 movie that moved at a very, very slow pace. It was compelling for a movie made in the 70s.
And you would know how.
And that's about all I can say about that. I know that the whole like birthing process and being raised is pretty slow, and that took me, about 25 years to get to where I am, and I was born in 92. So I assume, another 20 years before that, just, everything's slower.
What? Okay. Well, you can listen to that podcast. I have actually never, it's been very, like almost never. I've never seen Zach in such a state after watching
I was
that movie.
So tired, and I did not have a lot to say, which is one of the few times I've ever not been gushing with things to discuss with Alex.
Yeah. So it was, go ahead, take a listen to that. We had a good time talking about The Godfather. Actually, for our next movie review, we're going to be going over The Last Jedi, which is going to be the latest Star Wars.
The brand new Star Wars, so be on the lookout for that.
Yeah, so spoilers will be all over that thing. So watch yourself. Okay, well, I think it is time for fables. So I was trying to figure out if you want to get your knickers out of a bunch or put them back in a bunch for fable time. Let's just say get those knickers back into a bunch. It is fable time. And I believe, John, you have a wonderful fable for us today.
Thinking about differentiating self and doing that in the midst of family, of trying to be a separate person. I can think about a book I'm reading now called Growing Yourself Up by Jenny Brown. So you may want to check out that book. It's a pretty good book. But that particular book talks about how to grow up self and to manage self better than we have in the past. And when one does that, when one decides to do something different, there's typically some pushback or sabotage that's going to want someone to go back to the way things used to be. I liken it to an example I was reading about just the other day about a business leader who decided that the business that they were leading, they were a president of a company, that as I was kind of reading this particular story, they were talking about how things in the company were going really smooth, that there was not a lot of employee conflict, that people seemed to be pretty happy. However, when we looked at the metrics of the business was not growing at all. The employees were somewhat lazy, and they were just, I wouldn't say mailing it in, but they weren't exactly burning the midnight oil, if you will, working hard. And so this particular individual began to think carefully about how the group and the expectations of the group were affecting this person's functioning. And he decided to make some changes and hold people more accountable. And what do you know? The complaints started to roll in. The accusations began to be hurled at him that he was a bully, that he was targeting certain employees, and they took things very, very personal. Now, in this particular story I was reading, what was particularly interesting to note is it wasn't all the employees that felt things were not heading in the right direction. As a matter of fact, most appreciated being challenged because they felt like that's what they needed. But the vocal few, the vocal minority, they really began to push back and try to encourage the leader to stop being so, how should we say, I don't know.
Stop making waves.
Stop making waves.
Uh-huh.
Stop being,
Let the water still.
let the water still.
Yeah,
Let
get that auto reverse on. I want to get back to the way the things used to be.
get back to the way things used to be. So that's a particular fable that I was thinking through and reading through, and it's applicable to a lot of different situations. But when a leader decides to do something different, there's typical, sabotage that can look like lots of different things.
And it's interesting to think, like, I'm just thinking through that process. When the leader decided to make those changes, right, up until that point, you had two contrasting views of what was happening, per se, right? You had the leader who's thinking everything's all right, and you have the employees that, while the waters are calm, they don't have any insight into the leadership, the person who's guiding their organization, which from a family systems theory can cause anxiety, right? That can be that chronic anxiety. And it takes a new perspective, either someone coming in to provide that perspective or often someone making that chronic anxiety acute.
Yeah, and that just led to reactivity. As you said, it brought it to the surface and led to the reactive behaviors. And in this particular story, the leader was just taken off guard by the way people took it so personal, that it wasn't personal, but as a general rule, in a family or in any organization, the least mature tend to take things very personal. They tend to think about relationships a lot, of who's for me and who's against me. And so as you consider the holiday season coming up, think about, it's easy for us to say, oh, there's Aunt Frida or Uncle George, and boy, they're a piece of work. But I was reading the other day about, think of what other people have to deal with you or with me. So as people who listen to this podcast, it's one of the questions to consider is, what are people up against when dealing with you? And I think that's a question worth reflecting on.
Well, I think that's a great transition to get us into our question today and our topic, which is dealing with your family, how to deal with your family during the holidays. Now, one holiday is currently passed already. It's Big Old Turkey Day where we eat copious amounts of food and feel like crap. And you can just blame yourself for how you feel that day.
And you're supposed to give thanks for it too. You got to be thankful you're a piece of lard laying on the couch wishing you had more mashed potatoes.
Yeah, and then there's just also copious amounts of leftovers who, is debated and divvied between, the other family members.
The go-to quote is, "Does anyone want to take home some turkey? There is turkey left over."
Which alone can make its own issues as we go along. So gentlemen, as we have us ourselves and also our listeners are going into this holiday season, and John, you already kind of mentioned some of these things, but I'll just come up with a couple different examples of family issues since that's what we're talking about, especially during holidays. Me, myself, I remember growing up, and on my father's side, sorry, any of my family members who are listening, that's on my father's side, but there was Aunt Margie, and she was known as the person that was stirring the pot, as you were, at every family event, and saying ridiculous things and all sorts of ridiculousness, which I'm sure we all
have that family.
We all had that family member in there. So I don't want to diagnose anything, but perhaps one of the least differentiated in the group. I don't know. So we have those certain instances that I'm almost certain that we're all aware of. So let's just start there, maybe. Okay, we all have the black sheep or the thorn in the family, which I think would be really, like you said, John, though, that look in the mirror first, because that could be you. But we all know that those people are out there, including could be yourself. So as a leader, you're trying to function better within your family to try to lower anxiety. So especially during the holidays, like what does that look like? How do we do that with our families, which is, one of the hardest things to do? What do you think?
I think one thing to consider is how to be an observer in the family. And it may look like speaking little, asking questions of others, and doing something a little different than you've done in the past. So I can think about the difficult Aunt Margie that you shared, and what typically happens in that situation with someone who can be domineering or very reactive is we tend to avoid them.
Yeah.
And
we don't invite them to we don't invite them to stuff, or in my family too, sorry to interrupt, but we've even, I'm sure this happened in other families. We're actually just not even going to meet with this family now because of it's gotten so bad.
So think about what happens and we'll use Aunt Margie as an example. When that takes place, there's even more distance. So here's what happens. Individuals who are uncomfortable with one another distance from each other as a way to get calmer. But what happens almost ironically is there's too much distance, and the anxiety on both parts actually goes up. And it's kind of a unique way what that could happen. So instead of distancing, perhaps be curious about Aunt Margie and think about that. So I could think about in my leadership class, we were talking in school this week. Actually, it was before Thanksgiving, and someone was sharing about a difficult family member that they had. And I said, perhaps you could ask this question. Aunt so-and-so, as they talk about college, what was it like for you when you were graduating from high school? Did you have a situation where you were unsure of what you wanted to do? Because right now I have some thoughts and ideas and I'm not quite sure. People put pressure on me, asking me what I want to do. And how did you deal with that when you were my age? So now we're flipping it a little bit. And instead of running away from Aunt Margie, you're now pursuing her in ways and being curious about her. And it's something different than people have done in the past. And what systems theory suggests is try something different and see how the system might respond. So curiosity is something that I would consider doing.
Yeah, and so when you're becoming an observer, that doesn't necessarily mean you're changing your role You kind of are because you're becoming more aware, but it doesn't necessarily mean doing anything different other than watching the ways that people are relating to one another already. So nothing really has to change outside of the system except for you, and you can still react the exact same way, but now you're aware of it.
So we're not saying like this is where my brain went to. We're not saying like you're being the martyr here. Like I'm falling on the grenade, everybody. I'm gonna talk to Aunt Margie, and we're gonna go sit in the corner and talk. So everybody else can have a good time.
And we're also not saying being the observer is you being the person in the corner, not interacting with anyone. Doesn't mean disconnecting completely.
Yeah, we're not looking in from outside, peering through the window
Right.
at the family as you sit outside. So we're not observing from that distance.
Yeah, not like a Santa Claus or anything.
We're not judging who's naughty and nice. We're just watching Santa make his list. But that's to bring it back on track. That's a good point though. Is planning in advance what you want to talk about. One of the things that I think is a struggle with extended family is you don't see them often,
No.
and so very often you don't have those common things to relate about. You have these general things, and it's what's your relationship status, what's your career or schooling going like, and how about that sports team we both like, and outside of that, you don't know what to talk about. You haven't thought about how to relate to them, and taking something of your own life and saying, hey, I have this thing that I'm thinking about. Have you ever been in a similar situation? And just letting them go. That's a good place to start because you've planned it in advance, and even if you don't need it, you have it in your back pocket.
Yeah. Yeah, getting up in that proverbial tree and seeing what's going on there. Staying quiet, perchance. I mean, I was just in a situation during Thanksgiving that could have been tense. Could have been very tense. And I mean, even going into that situation thinking, man, maybe maybe we shouldn't do this. It came to a point to where my family was just nervous about it. But went through with it and just kind of stayed quiet and let things roll off, and things went really, really well. Because the anxiety was lower. I don't know why that is. I think I had a part to play in that. Usually, I'm the one that jumps in and I got to save this conversation. Oh, I got to fix this. Oh, this person said this. Oh, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I just kind of shut my mouth and kind of just did more listening, and so that might be helpful there. As a fixer myself, it feels like, oh, nobody's talking to Aunt Margie. I better go talk to her. Or, oh, Aunt Margie said this. I better go and, make sure she doesn't say that again. Like maybe that's not the exact thing that we need to do at that point in time. So,
Yeah, it sounds as if you were looking for fires that weren't necessarily there. Someone doesn't have to be talking to Aunt Margie all the time. Small changes do make waves.
yeah. And planning, it's funny. You talk about planning to have some things to talk about, which I think is a good thing. I was actually talking to somebody recently who has a family coming out of town, which I'm certain that is a lot of us. Family coming in town, and they are planning on how to deal with the anxiety that is coming with that family. Detailed plans of this is where we're going to sleep, and when they say this, we're going to do. Now, it might not be that deep, but like there are, plans put in place to be able to deal with the anxiety, which I found interesting, helpful, I think, in some ways. I don't know the full story, but at least there's a mindfulness behind it. And it could have easily been one of those things like, well, we're just not going to have them come because that's super, this isn't good.
Yeah.
But cool. Any other thoughts you guys think of when it comes to families coming into town, or we're having these holiday times and dealing with different family members? I think we've definitely hit on, being an observer and being curious with different family members. Let's do this real quick, John. I know that you and I have talked about this a lot. Why is it so important to be curious on that end with different family members? So let's just even go with immediate family members. So some of us are older, and we might not see our parents as much. And why is that connection between your parents important in a way of being, curious? Like, is there a connection there when it comes to anxiety, perchance, like generational?
I don't know where that big thick book is that you had from Murray Bowen, but one of the efforts that Dr. Bowen undertook was in his own family. He posited that if he would work on one-on-one relationships with individual family members, parents, siblings, children, and then the extended family of aunts and uncles, et cetera, that he believed that that would lead to someone being more centered and being calmer. And whether it's instinctual, where it comes from, I'm not really quite sure. But it seems to me that those who are the most reactive are also ones that have the most strained family relationships. I think there's certainly, I wouldn't say causation necessarily, I certainly would go with correlation for sure. And so I don't know that I could even surmise why that is. I mean, I guess I have some theories behind why, but it just seems to make sense.
Yeah, I mean, even on when we go biological level, I mean, you literally are made up of these people. I mean, your DNA is from these people, and their experiences are probably in similar series some ways, because they came from the same seed, as it were, and so they got the same reactivities going on there, and the same, automatic functioning, which we've talked about, and all of those different things.
So with that in mind, and you got me thinking, if we went from a biological perspective, then if I am disconnected with those that I have genetic connection with,
Yeah.
I feel exposed, I feel vulnerable, I feel in danger. And when I feel in danger, I think threat. And when I think threat, I think reactivity, emotional thinking, and all that. So it seems like there may be a connection between my reactivity and my lack of connection with family.
Yeah, and that would be like you're the single cell that's not even a part of the system whatsoever. I mean, in biological senses, I mean, we're talking about science here. I'm loving it. So there's, a cell makes up tissue, which makes up an organism. So there's two of these things that could be somewhat dangerous. A cell by itself, right, cutting off, and then also a tissue would be like, okay, this family, my system, is no longer interacting with this family, this other tissue, which just so happens to be part of the whole organism of this entire family, not just immediate, but, the entire last name or DNA ancestry of this. So, there's something to that as well. What were you going to say?
Yeah, the thing that I'm thinking about and trying to pull it into something I can understand and grasp a little bit more. I'm still working through that whole biology. But I just think we are people who look for examples, because we talk about your, base differentiation comes a lot from your family, and that's because the way that you act is often the way that you haven't consciously thought about. It's just the way you've always acted. And the way that you've always acted is the way that you've learned how to act from your family, right? And I love this example. Propaganda, great artist. He talks about you, and this is his song, Board of Education, right? But he spells it B-O-R-E-D, which is, it's piece on the educational system. But he talks about this point where, I know you're a fan, you're not offended, you love him. But he talks about, Mama never sat me down and told me how to wash the dishes. She pulled up a chair, she handed me a dish rag, and she said, "You're going to dry," right? Like that sort of thing. And of course, I'm butchering his artistic poetry, but it's this whole idea that we've learned, and when we think of how to do something, we look to those examples in our lives, and when we're disconnected from our immediate family, right? We don't have that example to fall back on. And a specific example of that I've been thinking about, I've been watching This Is Us on television, and it's all about family conflict, and it's overly dramatized.
You've cried a lot.
I'm not super into it, but I've been thinking about if you struggle with the same issues that your parents did, your predecessors did, and you never saw them overcome that, right? How much less likely are you to believe that you can overcome that as compared to if they overcame that, your belief that you can overcome it. Does that make sense to you guys following?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and I just think about what you shared, and I mentioned the curiosity piece of asking questions. I think there's another piece there, that the story piece, that if I can tell stories and hear others tell, there's something powerful about stories in families. And so as you think about the holiday season coming up, I might suggest being curious. If Aunt Frida wants to talk about the fact that, this isn't true, but the fact that I'm still single, let's say, to say, what, Aunt Frida, I know you married Uncle Fred at 22, but did you ever struggle with relationships prior to Uncle Fred? And what was that like? And I think somewhere she'll be interested in offering her perspective. And then you dig below the surface a little bit, and now you've approached her a little bit differently. And then the second aspect is stories. Ask her to share stories about what it was like to be a kid, or what it was like to be, you talk to her about my first job. What was your first job like? I think if you try those things, you might be surprised at what you find.
Yeah. And everybody likes a good story. I mean, even as you're talking about that, I'm like, I want to know Frida's story now. Like, I want to know what's going on. So, yeah.
Yeah, we're so often to cast this single time image of someone in our heads, and we think, this is who they are. I don't need to know them anymore. And then we start asking questions. We start becoming curious. We start learning more about them. And it's like it's a whole different person you didn't have any idea about.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, I think we did pretty good there. Do you have anything else to add to that, gentlemen? I mean,
yeah, I would say be patient. It takes time to make a change in families, but I firmly believe it's worth it. And I think it can pay off in huge ways. And I'll say this, if for those that are listening that are parents, what a great gift to give to your kids, that they can inherit a family that's a little bit calmer. I think that's a great legacy to leave.
Yeah, I think about that a lot. My future family is what, if there's any gifts I can give, that's a huge gift. So good luck with your families during this time. Just be patient, be an observer, ask a lot of questions, be curious, ask for those stories. It is worth it. In the end, it is worth it. Somehow you need to be connected, and as organisms, we want to be connected to our family. It's just part of who we are. And so as a recap, I think those are the major things.
Yeah, just be aware of what's going on around you.
Yeah.
Bowen's theory says you're a part of a system.
For sure. Well, with that, I believe we need to close this thing down. You can get a hold of us on the email, theofpodcast@gmail. That's theofpodcast@gmail. Also, catch us on Facebook. We are on YouTube. Where else can you find us?
Simplecast, Google Play, anywhere you can find a podcast, you can find us. Just type in the overfunctioning one-word podcast, and we should pop up.
Yeah. And shout-outs, we've got my boy Jason, who's given us this gear so far. So thank you. Shout-out to him.
And we got Jesse Huffstetler, who provided us with
the Simplecast Spemix Analyzer.
Yes, the rainbow limiter or starfish limiter or whatever it's called. It's making us sound pretty. And he also provided us with this theme song that we'll be playing shortly. And remember to send us questions if you have a specific situation that you want us to talk through. And we love doing that sort of stuff.
Oh, yeah. It's my favorite. Well, with that, we're going to be signing off here. I am Alex.
I'm John.
And I'm Zach.
And we'll talk to you next time. See ya.